So you're going to show where you stretch all those people, so you're going to show us the dungeon?
I might try to show a move or two.
Yeah. I'll take some moves, sir.
Do you feel that?
Oh, yes, sir. I don't feel my arms, sir. I can feel it.
Can you feel that, sir?
Oh, yes, sir.
Red,
oh, yeah.
Rosy.
Yes, sir.
And by taking this arm back here,
no.
you just ease his hand in the position here. I got the power here to...
Stop it, sir. Stop.
You're listening to Heartbeat Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Heartbeat Radio. I'm your co-host, Matthew Merz, calling in from the great state of Washington. On the line with me is the trainer of legends, Bruce Hart from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. How are you this evening, Bruce?
I'm doing fine, Matt. I kind of got a few goosebumps from that preamble there. It sounded like something out of Dungeons and Dragons or something like that.
Well, we've got a great show tonight for all the people listening. They've all been prepared on social media for tonight. We are going to have a wrestle lesson. We're diving into Bruce Hart's big book of booking, and we're going to learn about the science of wrestling psychology, how all of you can stop being a mark and start working an angle. Bruce Hart has trained and been involved with booking, giving pushes to the greatest wrestlers in the history of this business, from Jushin Thunder Liger, Davey Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid, to Chris Benoit, Brian Pillman, Shinya Hashimoto, Owen Hart, Gary Albright, Jim Neidhart, Jake the Snake Roberts, the Junkyard Dog, the Honky Tonk Man, and countless other names. So when Bruce Hart talks, shut the hell up and listen. You're going to learn to stop listening to that guy who's been booking you for the last 5 years, who's never drawn a dime pretending he was a professional wrestler, and now he's got you wrestling for him, not drawing a dime, pretending that you're a professional wrestler. Bruce Hart's going to help you overcome the obstacles of backyard promotions and wannabe pro wrestlers and wannabe promoters. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's show, Bruce, because it's long overdue in this business where people finally had to start having a little bit of accountability for what they're doing, because there's only two things you do when you get involved in this business. You either help this business or you hurt this business. And a lot of people have spent the last 2 decades hurting the business. And tonight, Bruce is going to teach you how to help the business, which is going to help your own business. And by your own business, I mean your pocketbook. So if you want to make money in the wrestling business, now would be the time to understand there's a reason God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. It's so you can listen twice as much as you talk. So, Bruce, where do we start here this evening? I mean, what is professional wrestling?
I think that's part of the problem these days is a lot of the people running promotions, including people at the very top end, seem to be unable to define that, or they are constantly clouding the waters to the point where there's not a clear perception as to what it is, or it's what it's seeking to be, or whatever. But you almost got to go back to reestablishing what it is and what the fans would like to perceive it to be, and I think proceed from there. And it should appear to be some type of physical. My dad used to refer to it as souped-up amateur wrestling, but in actuality, it's considerably more sophisticated than that. In that even though it appears to be somewhat of an individualistic endeavor, it's more of a team thing. Where you're interacting with the guy you're working with, your so-called opponent. Quite often you're perceived to be mortal enemies or, a bit of rivals or something like that, when in actuality it's about kind of getting each other over and interacting effectively, and in the course of that, inducing or inviting the fans to be part of it, or you subliminally.
Now let's talk about that for a second, Bruce. The fans becoming part of it, because how a wrestler should perceive themselves and how a fan should perceive a wrestler are two very different things. Now the fans should be out there looking at you as two athletes who are in a competition. kids today don't realize that typically the men who got into professional wrestling had a successful amateur career as wrestlers, and now they were turning pro, just like you would see with a basketball player or a football player coming out of university. They were turning professional because it was a good way to make money. And they weren't necessarily mortal enemies in the beginning.
No, I think back in the maybe the Toots Month, the Frank Gotch, Strangle Lewis, days, it was less about people being bitter enemies and all this type of thing. But I think somewhere around that, maybe the 20s or something, Toots Month and some of those guys recognized that if you created these, sometimes enhanced rivalries, and bad guys, good guys, and trash talking and stuff, it sold tickets, and that kind of was the genesis of it. And pretty much all these sports now, whether it's Sonny Liston and Muhammad Ali or Smoking Joe and Ali or whatever, they've all kind of gone that route. But I think guys coming into the business now need to be, too many of them are getting off track from so-called conventionality. There's too much non-wrestling aspects, and any of the non-wrestling aspects, be it the costumes, the talk, the special effects or the high spots or whatever, it should be supplementing and complementing the wrestling, not detracting from it or inviting ridicule or skepticism, and that's part of the problem these days. Too many of the kind of non-wrestling elements tend to invite ridicule or make people roll their eyes and say this is bullshit, and so there needs to be more convergence on that. But as I was saying before, for all intents and purposes, it should resemble a fight, quite often, depending on the preconceived schematics with the talk and whatever, maybe a bitter knockdown, drag 'em out, Mortal Kombat type thing, but it needs to resemble a fight. The wrestlers, it's like you were saying before, if you're going to be a football player or basketball player, you have to, in order to become a pro, you have to have kind of mastered the sport or become really good at it and, risen to the top level. And it looked like most of the guys who were out there were pretty legitimate, tough guys, and they looked like they were a league above, the fans of the marks, as they call them, and that seems to have kind of dissipated quite a bit, unfortunately, and that's not been necessarily good for the business, where you got too many guys out there that don't look like they could kick anyone's ass. And if you went to a Super Bowl game or a Stanley Cup or something, and you saw guys who looked like they could barely skate and all this other, at some point it would pervert your perceptions. Not to be knocking anybody, but I've been at countless indie shows that you see guys in homemade outfits and little skinny guys and guys that don't look like they know a wrist lock from a wristwatch, so to speak, and they're wearing a belt. And even any of those indie promotions, I would recommend to them, that they, for their own good, raise the bar a bit, set standards higher. The promoters or whoever the guys are running those should be endeavoring to make their wrestlers or athletes or whatever look like they can actually fight they're pretty legit, and maybe endeavor to bring people into the business that have some, like back in the day, that was the rationale behind the dungeon or whatever, was, these guys would have to pay their dues, and it was like that, and not just in the dungeon, but a lot of the territories. If you were endeavoring to break into Vern Gagne's territory or Dory Funk Sr.'s territory, or in England they had the Wigan so-called snake pit, and these guys had to go through a lot of pretty hard scrabble trials and tribulations in order to be deemed worthy of being put in the ring. And
what we're talking about is what we heard there at the beginning of the show with your father what they call stretching a guy, joint manipulation, if you will.
It wasn't just one time you got stretched. You had to go through the three-headed dog at the gates of hell, maybe for 6 months or whatever, to see if you had any staying power and if you were up to the task. And it was also about instilling respect for the business and respect for yourself, so you were, far more likely to protect the ostensible propriety of the business and that type of thing. But it all served that purpose, where I would say that's one of the reasons why MMA, UFC or whatever, has been successful or as well received as, there's this perception rightfully derived that those guys are all pretty serious ass kickers. The average fan would be saying, I wouldn't want to go in there and, test that guy or whatever, because he'd probably kick my ass. And wrestling used to be like that, they're in part because most of those guys could kick your ass. The guys like the Stus and the Luthezes and the Carl Gotch and all that, And that was one reason why people looked up to and idolized and aspired to be like that, is because they were worthy of that, And I think wrestling needs to, including WWE, they've deviated from that, too much, where they've had guys that don't necessarily look like they could kick anyone's ass, like people maybe like the Miz and Heath Slater and people like that. They tend to diminish people's perceptions, and it's like Andre Agassi, the tennis player, used to say, image is everything, and you have to endeavor to create these kind of larger than life characters that people are reactive to, whether they're in awe of them or hate them or whatever, but they have to look like they're on a higher level than you, I would think,
Now let me ask you this, Bruce. Is it fair to say that before you can create a larger than life persona for yourself, you need to put on a simple pair of trunks and learn how to wrestle?
Positively. It's like anything else, like the other sports we were talking about. You have to pay your dues. You have to, like, in order to play in the NHL, you have to have gone out countless times in these little cold skating rinks and whatever, over and over and over, and have guys checking you and coaches bitching at you, and that's just part of it. Or, if you want to play in the NFL, whether you're Tom Brady or whoever, you had to have paid your dues over and over and over in high school and college. And I think wrestling needs to do that. You need to reestablish the wrestling in order for all the other elements, be it the showbiz, the talking, the high spots, the character development, and all that other. At no point can you or should you lose sight of the fact that it still needs to be the main course, the wrestling. Just like the Super Bowl game, you got Lady Gaga and all the other whatever, but still the main course is the football, and wrestling needs to do that. But in order to do that, it needs to kind of go back to what we were talking about, the basic elements of it, the actual wrestling and trying to pin each other and make the guy submit and knocking guys out or whatever. But it has to look like it's this. Still, that's the.
You have to reestablish the rules. I mean, there's no rules anymore. We can tumble outside a ring and knock each other into guardrails and hit each other with chairs, and that meant something at one point in time, because that started as just a match where we shook hands in the beginning, and then one of us got more heated up over the course of using a series of wrestling holds on each other.
Oh yeah.
You maybe get heated up at me.
It was a very systematic process where in the old days it was a very simple, and it should still be this type of a simple corollary where the baby face or the good guy gets, kind of out wrestles or outwits or kind of like Coyote Roadrunner type stuff. He out wrestles or dominates the bad guy, and the bad guy, in order to even score or compete or whatever, he has to cheat. But he does it in such a subtle way that he doesn't make the referee look like an idiot or insult the ostensible integrity of it. And then in so doing, he pisses the fans off and gets his heat, which is, the prime objective for the heel. And then flip side is the baby faces getting sympathy, which is, what it's all about. As for, best example of it in recent times I can think of is Daniel Bryan. He would be selling and selling and selling, not dying, I might add, but selling. And in so doing, he subliminally kind of, induces the crowd, most of whom are underdogs, themselves or can relate to being kicked while they're down, to, become the wind beneath their wings. And then the babyface finally mounts this big cataclysmic comeback, at which point the face either goes over and people, have a big celebration, or more often than not, you have them, victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, by some dastardly deed, or the referee DQing some or something like that. But and that was a simple formula, and it should pretty much still be that. It's that's one of the things WWE needs to realize is you still need to stick to these basic precepts in order to make it work. You can add some of these enhanced elements as long as they don't detract or eclipse the wrestling, and that's part of the problem. And exactly like you were saying with the rules, in baseball they have artificial turf, and they got designated hitters, and they got Philly Fanatic and all this other, but it's still baseball. It's still 3 outs to an inning and 9 innings, and if you hit it over the fence, it's a home run. If it's foul, it's foul. You're not deviating from that where you're saying it's a home run when it was a foul ball, or there's 4 outs to an inning, or 14 players on the field instead of 9, and you have to stick to the basic rules and whatever the hell that were established. And
to the people listening, look at it this way: who is the best heel in pro sports today? It's Tom Brady. The Patriots cheat. We know there are rules in football. The Patriots continue to cheat, and they continue to win, and they're the Ric Flair of pro football. And without those rules, it wouldn't be cheating, and there would be no heel. It would just be MMA.
What's critical to recognize when you're saying that is that Tom Brady's not taking a chainsaw out of his pocket on the field, or he's not, and Robert Kraft.
But if you got him more heat, he might do that.
So, it's all fairly subtle and within the rules, and that's what wrestling needs to be more of. And what you need to do when you're reestablishing the rules is, beyond everything else, being consistent. You can't DQ a guy for something one match and then let it go the next match, and I think the fans would prefer that. Back in the day, there was a few built-in supposed rules or technicalities that enabled you to really perpetuate and propagate your storylines. For example, if you threw a guy over the top rope, it was a DQ.
Oh, in Portland wrestling, that was a DQ for sure.
Yeah, if you ran a guy into the post, whether it was accidental or whatever, or, if you were on the floor for more than 10 seconds, was it counted out? Or if you didn't break at 5, it was a DQ. If you were caught
I don't think I ever saw I never saw referee Sandy Barr leave the ring to break up wrestlers when I was going to Portland wrestling as a kid here in the Pacific Northwest. That didn't happen because those wrestlers, if they were brawling outside, it was because all hell had broken loose. It wasn't because that's what they do each and every week at this wrestling show, like you see prevalently on the indie scene and in WWE, which is sad because it's almost synonymous, because all these indie guys, and you know who you are, you're all mimicking what you watch on Monday night because you're not a real worker. You're a mark who's going to an indie promotion.
I would stress to any of them what they need to do and what's more likely to see them succeed is strive not to be a horseshit clone or a cheap imitation of some existing WWE star, but endeavor to be an original. You know, I know back in the 80s when Hulkamania and all that stuff was going on, and Vince McMahon had taken all our top guys at that time, including Davey and Dynamite and Brett and Bad News and guys like that. I had a bunch of rookies at that time, including Owen and Benoit and Pillman and Liger and a few others. And one of the first things I told them is, I don't want you guys trying to be a copy of Randy Savage or Hulk Hogan or whatever the hell. I want you guys to be a compelling alternative. And you guys go out and wrestle, and you guys do what you're best at. And those guys all went on to superstardom later on, but they were bound and determined to be themselves, they weren't trying to be the second coming of Randy Savage or Ultimate Warrior or any of that. They were doing their own thing, and that was why they got over. My dad always used to say there's all kinds of Elvis impersonators out there, but most of them are playing in lounges and starving and having to do a day job, and I think young wrestlers need to do that rather than trying to be the second coming of CM Punk or
be the second coming of Eddie Graham or be the second coming of Billy Robinson. If you can be as fluid and as quick as Billy Robinson is, people are going to notice you. Whereas if you're doing the people's elbow and you're raising your eyebrow and imitating a WWF performer who's far more successful than you, no one cares.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of embarrassing. You're embarrassing yourself.
Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, but that shouldn't be your objective, to flatter some overpaid, egocentric superstar. Your objective should be to supplant and replace that egocentric, over-the-hill superstar, and any of the aspiring wannabes out there need to kind of revisit what wrestling is, which is using wrestling techniques and whatever else to pin, make, submit, or knock out, or beat your opponent. It all sort of evolves from there. And all too often these guys, these days when I'm watching WWE, I see guys doing everything but try to pin a guy, or they conversely have so many false finishes where they're having 2 count, 2 9/10 kick out, to the point where you don't even take it seriously. My dad used to say it should to some degree resemble almost like a chess match on the mat, where you're doing holds and counter holds and trying to get the guy into check and building to that big quintessential climax and taking the fans along with you for the ride. But it needs to look systematic and calculating. And the great workers back in the day, I can think of guys like Nick Bockwinkel and the Billy Robinsons and the Dory Funks and all. They would kind of systematically and artfully kind of build to this cataclysmic climax. They never at any point, that was one of the impressive things about any of those guys, at no point did they ever let the tail wag the dog. Like nowadays I see these smart marks and shitheads out there going, holy shit and boring and you fucked up and and the wrestlers all go to pieces and start trying to oblige these misfits. Instead you should be go wherever your instincts take you, and at no point did you ever see a Dory or a Harley or any of those guys changing their game plan because some marks said boring or whatever. They would just stick to it, and in most cases the fans would get into it. And
now I want to go back to Nick Bockwinkel for a second, Bruce, because I do think that's a very, and Kurt Hennig was really the same way in a lot of ways. And
they were all
the way they carry themselves out to the ring And I think we really need to get that deep with people here. You know, Nick Bockwinkel walks out there, and he carries himself, and in his eyes you see he believes he's a professional wrestler. Whereas if you go down to the local indie show, you're going to see a lot of guys, and they look like they're entertainers and they're having fun, but they're not taking it serious. Whereas if you go watch any Nick Bockwinkel match, he carries himself with a sense of seriousness. He's sizing up his opponent before they even touch each other. You can see the wheels turning, that he's trying to figure out how he's going to win this match and best this man.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point there, because everything back in the day with the Nick Bockwinkel's, Dynamite Kid or Luthez, guys like that, was very serious and professional, and the fans would be looking in Nick Bockwinkel's eyes and all like that to see if there was any weakness or whatever, and there wasn't, and they would react to that. You know, my dad always used to say the fans only react to your reactions, but if you look nonchalant or indifferent or like you're not really taking it seriously, which is unfortunately all too often the case, how the hell can you expect the fans to take it seriously or buy into what you're trying to sell, you know? And
if it's not serious, why should I pay money for it?
Oh yeah, why should I invest my emotions and my money and my time? And you know, and that's all they're wanting is during that time that you're out there, begging you to let them suspend their disbelief and cynicism. And it's like going to a good movie. You know, you maybe obviously know it's, you know, scripted or whatever, but if it's good enough, you put all that aside and you're kind of heart's beating and you're, you know, getting caught up in the drama and all that, which is exactly why you're going there. And neither you or I should even be having to tell these people that. You know, it's kind of like you guys should have known that a long time ago. You know, it's more of an affront that I'm having to remind them, you know, that it needs to look like a fight and it needs to look like you guys are, you know, mortal enemies and, you know, there's emotions and all this other, you know. But unfortunately, they do need to be reminded of that, and using a cliche, they need to get back to the basics in order to rebuild whoever the hell they are and maybe rebuild the foundations of the business. Some people may think I'm living in the past, but I'm every damn week in Calgary Friday night or Edmonton
You made a lot of
Saturday
fucking money in the past.
Yeah, we were every damn week. You know, those buildings were packed and those fans were clamoring, and that was a big part of their whole week was coming down to see Dynamite Kid fight Bret Hart or Davey Boy Smith fight Bad News Allen or whatever the hell, you know. And I think it needs to go back to that.
How do you get human beings emotionally invested in you? What do you have to do to do that? We talked about, you know, Nick Bockwinkel's presence, and how he took himself seriously.
You need to relate to them and make them relate to you. A big part of it is subtle and subliminal, where you're, you know, one of the things you need to recognize is the average wrestling fan is not a millionaire or a big man on campus or whatever. You know, most of them are average working class, you know, kind of guys who have do their 40-hour work week and, you know, sometimes are looked down on and they don't get the hot girl all the time or whatever, but they have a propensity for empathizing and sympathizing with the so-called baby face. And a big part of the wrestling is putting together these storylines or whatever that actually are kind of things the average fan can relate to. You know, the oppressive bully and that type of thing, and and it's actually a pretty simple formula. I know we did it out here for years, and you know, had incredible success with it. At times, I've seen WWE do it, but they seem to have, you know, deviated or gotten off track, or they invariably do all this non-wrestling bullshit. There's a tendency these days to do way too many high spots and way too much crap on the floor and all like that. If they did less of that, but they did it within the the parameters of the so-called fight, it would mean a lot more. Like when I see a whole card these days of so-called tables, ladders, chairs, or whatever, I sort of shake my head and say this is a contradiction of what it's all about, because in the old days when you did have some kind of a stipulation, it was few and far between, and it was always for a very pronounced reason. You finally got to, the stakes kept getting upped or whatever, and you finally had to, the only way to resolve it is in a cage or in a lumberjack or some such thing. But nowadays they just have those matches between a bunch of guys who don't even have any pre-existing issues or any of that. Like back in the day, that was the only reason why you would have some kind of a big no DQ or a tape fist match or whatever the hell. It was like the culmination of all this conflict and build-up, and finally the promoter would deem that as the only way that you could resolve this burning issue. We got to put them in a cage or, barbed wire or lights out or some bullshit, and whatever the hell you do, you should always have an ostensible purpose or rationale for it. And if at any time the booker or the promotion or whoever cannot explain that rationale or the reason why you had an 8-man, cage barbed wire set on fire match or some bullshit, if you can't explain explicitly the reasons for, doing that, then you shouldn't be doing it. You can't just have this kind of flinging shit against the wall mindset. Well, we'll have an 8-man elimination haircut match with the losers having to kiss the winner's ass or some bullshit. You have to set the table for anything you do, and you also need to be judicious in that, that you're not going to the well too often. You don't have a cage match every damn week, or a no DQ, or a, Hell in the Cell, or a triple threat haircut match every.
In the film industry, they would consider wrestling nowadays as the MacGuffin. It's why we all show up. We want to know what's going to happen with the nuclear plans that were stolen, or the diamonds that were stolen hiding in the briefcase that so-and-so's carrying, or this or that or the other. The things that we go to see the movie for are the same thing we don't even care about at the end of the movie, because we become emotionally invested in the characters we've watched, and we're more interested in their interpersonal relationships. And I think they've started treating wrestling like it's just the MacGuffin, It's why you tune in, but it's not really why you stick around. And so they've pushed it so far into the background you can't even see it anymore.
I think you got a key word there, emotionally invested, and that's one of the key elements that's been compromised or overlooked way too often. And it's surprising to me that WWE doesn't seem to realize that a lot more. Far be it from me to be telling those misfits anything, but Daniel Bryan was, he kind of was the poster child for emotional investment. He was as big a baby face as I've seen in the last 20 years as far as being over and all like that. And it was mostly because people emotionally invested. They could relate to this little engine that could mindset, and they need to go back to that. It drives me nuts. Even some of these new guys I've seen coming up, I'm going, wow, they're doing some incredible stuff, like these cruiserweights and stuff, but they're doing way too much, and they're not doing it at the optimal time. If they did less and they did it kind of within the parameters of the emotional roller coaster that the people are there to go on, they would get way more reaction, and there's some of these very simple corollaries, one of which, when I was starting, was the cell sets up the comeback.
Let's talk about what that means, Bruce. Let's go into detail. First, what is the cell?
The cell is a baby face getting, beaten down, and heel quite often is using illegal tactics, but doing it subtly enough that the referee isn't in the middle all the time. But one of the big parts of it, as I said before, is the average fan is somewhat of an underdog himself. They can relate to being bullied or being talked down, or their bosses giving them shit at work, or the teachers, giving them grief, and it's important to recognize that right from the get-go, because it gives you an ability to kind of play on that. So anyway, the baby face is getting screwed, and beaten down, and the heel is kind of bullying him, and he's getting his heat and all. But the baby face always, they have this never say die mindset, which is what endears them to the crowd. They keep trying to, overcome, and the heel beats them back down, and at no point do they die, as they call, some of the not very good workers in the day used to do what we call dying, where they just lay around and get their asses kicked, and they never really got over because, people don't respond to a dead body, but, as long as there's a little bit of life in there, they, intrinsically try to bring it back to life, which is what it's all about. But anyway, as a rule, we used to have this thing called the pendulum theory, that the farther you took the sympathy or whatever, as far as getting beaten down, it would swing all the way back. The really great workers. I remember guys like Rick Martel and some of those great baby faces from back in the day, the Luther Lindsays, and even some of the guys who weren't necessarily the greatest workers, but they understood that sell sets up the comeback. Like Jim Hellwig was a good example, the Ultimate Warrior. When he did finally make the big comeback, or Hogan was another one, it would be balls to the wall, all systems firing, and what they do is they bring the crowd along with them on that roller coaster ride. The crowd is getting with you, like, go, Hulk, go, and stomping and cheering, and Daniel Bryan, as I alluded to, the yes, yes, yes. When Daniel finally would do the big comeback, the crowd would be along for the ride, and that, they gained an incredible intrinsic satisfaction because they felt like they were part of it. It's the same in any sport, which is why people wear, team colors and do the wave and all that other stuff, because they want to feel like they were part of the penultimate victory and all like that.
I'm booking you in a match against Daniel Bryan. You're the heel, of course. Come on, who else?
Yeah.
You've got 20 minutes out there with Daniel Bryan.
What you need to be doing is kind of innately sensing, a big part of being a great worker is having this intuitive sense of how far you can take them before you bring it back the other way, and one of the other things you do in the course of that is you throw in a few spots, we used to call them false finishes, where you allow the baby face to do like a sunset flip or a backslide or a small package or something like that, and the heel beats him down even more mercilessly because he had the audacity to try to pin him. When you have the big comeback at that point, that was what one of the things I noticed. All the great baby faces, whether they were great athletes or workers, they all had that sense. Finally, when they did the comeback, they did it with incredible fire and passion and balls to the wall, or whatever the cliche is, and that was like the hallmark of any of the great faces. Even back in the day with Hulk Hogan, it's pretty simple. It's, as I said before, that interactive triangle with you, your opponent, and the fans, and you don't need to script it or any of that. You just kind of do it intuitively. Too many of these damn matches are so damn scripted to the point that they become sterilized. My dad used to say you don't need a damned script to have good sex. It's pretty much intuitive. You build to the big climax, but what you do when you're scripting is you essentially are saying to the fans, you guys are not part of this equation. We're going to do whatever regardless of you. And that's the antithesis of what working is all about, because subliminally it should be looking like the fans are, with their cheering, their booing, their whatever else, exerting a pronounced influence over the whole thing, which is the whole point. My dad used to say there's no paint-by-numbers paintings in any museum, and that's what scripting tends to be, And in the old days, the only guys who ever scripted that I remember were, you'd have these really kind of nervous, somewhat inept rookies, and they weren't sure of, what to do, or they didn't have enough confidence in their own innate ability, so they would have all these, scripted, you do this and I do that, and I remember if you ever, in the old days, if you ever went up to one of the old veterans, Harley or something like that, and told them a bunch of high spots and bullshit that you wanted to get in, they would, kind of say, well, play it by ear, which is their way of saying, screw that, I don't need to be being told to do 3 of those and 4 of those, and that used to be the big knock on most of the Mexican wrestlers back in the day, and I think it still is they have all these scripted, they used to call them combinations or whatever the hell, and where they'd have all these high spots where, I'm going to do 3 of those and you do 2 of these, and then I'm going to jump up above in the top, and and
they never sell. Did they sell when you were coming up, Bruce?
It was almost a different mindset, and for a long time the Japanese were a bit like that too. You tell them that more is not better, do less, but do it better and slow it down a bit. That's another big part of it. What's not to digress, but with WWE is all too often I see them do a spot in the crowd. Sometimes it's a really good spot and the crowd's ready to, respond, and they're already off on the next spot. And after a while, it subliminally imparts to the crowd, you're cheering, you're booing, your reactions of no consequence. So that after a while, they don't even react because they know these guys are going to just do another spot and another spot, and that's the antithesis of what it's all about. The great workers, like some of the ones you mentioned, like Nick Bockwinkel and Billy Robinson and guys like that, after they had done a spot, there was this sort of a subtle pause, not only for them to catch their breath, but also to allow the crowd to respond. It's all part of working, is understanding that that dynamic, as I said before, between you, your opponent, and the crowd, and you should never lose sight of that whole thing, and if once you operate within that, it's far easier to get over, and you find that you're doing less but getting a better reaction. If you see some of those iconic matches from the past, like Brett and Davey Boy at Wembley and stuff like that, when you actually dissect it, you go, geez, they didn't do that much.
It's interesting because they have script writers now who write WWE. Professional wrestling is very much like a good screenplay in the sense that you have your first act, you have your introduction where you meet your 2 characters, your gentleman in the white trunks and the gentleman in the black trunks, and then you have this inciting incident there in the first, let's say, 15 minutes of a movie, just like in the first few minutes of a match where, you see which one of these 2 is the better technical wrestler, and then the gentleman in the black trunks does a move that's illegal. An inciting incident, they would call that in a screenplay. That's when the bad guy makes his appearance. And then for the next hour of the movie, you have your hero, the gentleman in the white trunks, doing everything he can to try to overcome this bad guy, but the bad guy's just too much for him. But then finally you get to that peak. There at the end of the second act, into the third act, and you have this giant culmination where the gentleman in the white trunks finds victory over the gentleman in the black trunks. And the crowd goes wild, and things are back to normal because justice prevailed and good has won. Is that pretty much correct?
Yeah, or in many cases, you have leave it hanging and you have a sequel.
And is that how you sell a ticket to next week?
Yeah, and it should still be that simple and logical. A couple of simple premises, whatever you do, it should have some reason or bearing on the outcome. If it doesn't, or it distracts or whatever, then it shouldn't be part of it. You should have a very clear idea of what your ostensible purpose, what you're seeking to accomplish, whether it's to get the face over, the heel over, or, set up a rematch. You should have a pretty clear idea of what your actual purpose is, and if you don't, then you shouldn't be orchestrating those finishes. It's pretty simple.
Let's talk about that for a second, Bruce. Let me slow you down here a little bit, Bruce, so we can kind of break this down, because there are layers of stories that you're part of as a wrestler. You're part of the promotion's annual trajectory. You're part of your own career's annual trajectory. You're part of the angle that you're currently in. You're part of that particular night's show and your spot on the card, which dictates what kind of a match you should have. You're part of the finish to propel that feud you're in and to sell tickets to next week. And then you also have the story of the actual match that you're in, which might be working the arm or working the leg or working this or doing this. So let's kind of take those one by one if we can, Bruce.
It should be pretty systematic, and you hit the nail on the head there, and that's one of the problems I see with these high spot fests and these whatever. In the old days, any of the old workers would induce you or, admonish you to just work an arm and keep coming back to it, and people could kind of follow that track. In the old days, you watch a Jack Briscoe and a Dory Funk or something, they'd keep coming back to the same thing and establish this kind of cohesive storyline that you would be following, and it would build up to this, resounding climax. And I think a lot of the young guys need to almost revisit that, stay on one track, don't be all over the damned map. You should know where you're trying to take them and how you're sequentially, upping the ante and building to this resounding climax. And it's pretty simple once you kind of understand that, and you start using, the holds and the wrestling techniques and the heel techniques, and using them as the means to propagate that. One of the biggest problems I see these days, and it's almost laughable, but I see these wrestlers where the first time some damned mark in the audience who's accustomed to high spots and all the other bullshit, as soon as somebody goes boring or whatever, these guys go to pieces. You have to sort of have enough confidence in yourself to stay the course and stick to whatever, your ostensible game plan was. And in most cases, if it's a half-decent game plan, you'll get the people on track, and too many of the guys out there right now are trying to accommodate the smart marks and all that, and I think the smart marks subliminally, would rather actually just get into the wrestling too, but at no point would you ever see a Dynamite Kid or a Brett or a Davey Boy or guys like that changing their style or whatever because some mark went boring or whatever the hell. You just stay the course, and most times you find those people start shutting up, and the other fans almost shut them down anyway. But yeah, you never let the tail wag the proverbial dog. You should have enough confidence in yourself to rise above that bullshit. Too many of the guys out there, unfortunately, they haven't mastered the wrestling end of it, which is the holds, the interchange, the taking of bumps, and all the the basic elements. And consequence, they have a propensity for just doing all the the chairs and the high spots and the getting on the mic during the match and all that bullshit. And, you almost need to go back to square one and reestablish some semblance of quasi-legitimacy.
I heard on another episode of Heartbeat Radio, a guy named Don Fargo. He said, I remember one time we were all training in the ring before a match, and a guy came into the territory and he demonstrated what a drop kick was. And, man, can we get back to that? I remember
back in the day, one drop kick was a finish.
It was, yeah.
Rocca. I think jumping
that was just in the 80s.
Back in the day, so many what are now, high spots or whatever, I remember one suplex was like a big thing, or pile driver used to be not only a finish, but it was like, one of those diabolical, stretcher jobs.
Oh, yeah.
Here goes,
illegal in Memphis.
Yeah, and you'd always have the guy carried on a stretcher and people going nuts and all like that, but it must be confusing for the damn fans, it should be fairly Pavlovian or fairly, cause and effect type thing, but once you deviate from that yourself, then...
Let's explain to the kids what that means, Pavlovian. You're referring to Pavlov's dog.
Yeah.
Who's trained, correct, Bruce?
You would give them for example, if Hulk Hogan did the big leg drop, it was automatically a finish and you didn't deviate. It's like Popeye got the can of spinach and, he does the big comeback on Pluto and that's that. But nowadays, you see all these things that used to be finishes, from pile drivers or, some devastating looking suplex or whatever. And nowadays they don't even get a one count out of it, and after a while, for me it must be confusing to the fans. And that's one of the things you shouldn't be doing if you're a good promoter, is confusing and contradicting your own, propaganda. You got to sort of remain within whatever it is.
Let's talk about that for a second, Bruce. Promoters. Okay. Promoters. Listen, people listening, some of you are promoters, some of you are wrestlers, some of you are fans. Stop supporting shitty promoters. You're killing the fucking business. Stop working for them. They don't even pay. They pay you $10 fucking. You go out there and break your neck for these assholes. They're killing the business.
I wouldn't even dignify them by calling them promoters. They're just kind of, in a lot of cases...
Well, they got a license, Bruce.
License to kill or whatever. But, they're, as I said before, you need to raise the bar. And I think one of the ways to do it is that I think some of these better indie promoters, like the Herb Simmonses and the Jesse Hernandezes and some of the others, they almost need to... reform some kind of a organization, sort of like what the old NWA was. I'm not suggesting that it will even be anything close to that, but they need to not only raise the bar but reestablish, some of the basic parameters of wrestling and what the rules and the regulations are. It's simple stuff, but I always used to say, if there's no damn rules, how do you get any heat? It's to your advantage to establish, it's just like the NFL. If they, said there's no downs or there's out of bounds is in, and and if it didn't go through the goalpost, it's still a good field goal. Like once you start deviating from your own shit, then how the hell are the fans supposed to react? But all too often the wrestling's become like that, where you got fighting on the floor, or nut shots or chair shots, or 8 guys beating up one and the referee looking the other way and all this bullshit.
Around Portland, Oregon, if you did a nut shot in a match at Sandy Barr's promotion, after the show was over, Sandy would punch you in the balls, and while you laid on the ground holding your testicles, he'd explain to you that's what happens when you hit a person in the nuts, so you shouldn't do it in a match because it's going to stop the match for 5 minutes while the person tries to find their balls.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I can appreciate the rationale there. But yeah, I think it would be a step in the right direction, as we were saying, for some of these more legitimate indie promoters to be interacting with each other, and I would say, as I said before, the WWE should be making some inroads in that direction too, with endeavoring to support or aid and abet some of those promotions, because it's ultimately good for them, if there's a more solid and more legitimate, credible foundation for the business.
What it does is it clarifies for everyone involved in the business, whether you're a promoter or a wrestler or a fan, if WWE gives an indie promotion a seal of approval, that legitimizes that promotion, and that helps to get rid of the shitty backyard indie promotions that are killing the business by poorly imitating WWE.
And by the same token, I think WWE needs to not to be casting aspersions on them, but they need to clean up their act too. Cut back on the bullshit, the extremism, the non-wrestling tits and ass, and the guys doing 20-minute promos between every match, and all the bullshit. And they also need to start doing a better job on the indie cards. Like when WWE comes to these towns, they unless it's a pay-per-view or it's a damned TV shot or whatever, more often than not, it's kind of this bare bones, go through the motions, take the money, and get the hell out of here. And that's bullshit too. They should.
Did Harley Race ever make you wrestle on a floor when a ring didn't show up in front of 20 people?
Yeah, I remember.
And explain
Harley
why he did that.
Yeah. Well, I remember actually one time we had a malfunction at the junction, as Ed Whalen used to say. I think our main event in Billings, Montana was Jake Roberts and Harley Race for the world title, and somehow the damned ring crew got their signals crossed, and they ended up going to Butte, and we had no damn ring. We had a sellout crowd down in Billings with Jake and Harley, and we're all kind of wondering what the hell we're going to do, and Harley said, "We'll fight on the damn floor." And that's exactly what they did. And Harley was taking the big backdrops and saved the show, as they say. It was kind of a reflection of what a real, kind of a professional like old Harley was,
And I think that's a good way to end tonight's Wrestle Lesson, Bruce. I hope we do this again in the future and cover another subject, whether that be booking or promoting or whatever.
I'm hoping that perhaps a few aspiring wrestlers listening out there might they get some useful perspective from it. It's got to be a step in the right direction for the whole business, but it's easier said than done, I guess, so hopefully we're serving some purpose in that regard.
I think all the people out there are going to appreciate it. I want to encourage all real professional wrestlers listening, if you're wrestling at a shitty indie show this weekend, ask to work with the worst guy on the roster and stretch the hell out of him. Make him want to quit the business, because that's good for your business. Like I said at the beginning, you can either help the business or you can hurt the business. So if you love the business, then help the business. I want to thank you, Bruce, and I'd like to spend the last few minutes of the show just talking about something real quick with you, Bruce, that's kind of related to this topic of stretching, but a little off topic. And I just want to play this for you and kind of get your thoughts on it, if that's all right.
Sure.
Isn't that enough?
That's some discipline. That's some discipline.
Can you tell me a little bit about that tape there, Bruce?
I was the guy who made it or recorded it. It's a funny thing. I was down in the dungeon that night with Dynamite Kid. We were, working out, and I think Stu was down there. We were just kind of talking, and these two Army boys just showed up out of the blue. And I think they'd had a drink or two, but they were, arrogant. And they said, hey, Stu, we want to challenge, I think, David Schultz, who was one of our main heels at the time. And my dad was initially trying to be just kind of like, you guys aren't ready for anything. And how about, Stu said something about, why don't you try on an old fart like me for, size before you go against the champion Schultz or whatever. And one of these idiots said, he was a big guy, he was about the size of Baron Corbin, a big, about 6'7", big, raw-boned misfit. And he said, no offense, Stu, but you wouldn't be any challenger or something like that. So all of a sudden, Stu, it kind of became almost kind of a challenge to Stu, and next thing Stu had him on the mat, and Dynamite and I were kind of watching. Stu stretched the hell out of him, put him through all these so-called sugar holds and torture holds, and at one point the other misfit that was with him picked up a weight and said, if you don't let him go, Stu, I'm gonna hit you with it. And Stu said, without even batting an eye, said, if you don't put that fucking weight down, I'll break his fucking neck. and this guy put the weight down, and it was funny. A few minutes later, when Stu finally let him go, they went fleeing out into the night. I don't think they even grabbed their shoes. It's the last thing anyone had ever seen of them. But it's funny. I happened to have a tape recorder with me at that time, and I pushed record, and that was kind of the where that tape came from. But it was kind of like
where's that tape at now, Bruce?
I'm honestly not sure. I think my beloved brother Brett borrowed it and never gave it back to me. But I know Brett used it in that celebrated video he did on. I'm sure if it was Living in the Shadows or what the hell it was called.
Wrestling with Shadows. Yeah,
Wrestling
excellent
with Shadows.
Documentary. Bruce, thanks for educating all of us. I really appreciate it.
We'll just scratch the surface, but I appreciate the people lending us an ear, albeit a cauliflowered one in some cases. But I appreciate their joining us tonight, and I'll look forward to next week. And in the meantime and in between time, I'll let you, Matt, pull the plug or whatever the cliche
Well, I'm just
is.
going to end this with, I'm going to end it with your dad stretching a kid in the basement. So here we go. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay, doesn't get much better than that.
So you're going to show where you stretch all those people? So you're going to show us the dungeon?
I might try to show a move or two.
I'll take some moves, sir.
Can you feel that?
Oh, yes, sir. I don't feel my arms, sir. I can feel it.
Can you feel that, son?
Oh, yes, sir.
Red,
oh, yeah.
Rosy.
Yes, sir.
And by taking this arm back here, you just ease his hand in the position here. I got the power here to...
Stop it, sir.
You're listening to Hart Beat Radio.
All the best, Matt. Take care. Thanks.